welcome to PitchPod. My name is Shauna Makovich from the Forest Link, and I'm bringing awareness to investment-ready forest and land use investment opportunities. Before we begin, a small disclaimer that what we discuss today is not to be taken as investment advice. If you're interested in learning more about the opportunity, we will have links for you in the show notes to help you out. Without further ado, let's get started. And today I'm happy to introduce you to Andreas Eke of Generation Forests. Andreas, welcome to PitchPod.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining. Before we get started, can you tell me what your favorite tree is?
That's
Ready for that?
No, I want. There are so many natives. Mahogany is beautiful, but rosewood. That's a tough question. That's a tough question. Ceiba maybe because it creates also a nesting place for the harpy eagle. Yes, but that's a tough question. I couldn't really.
I have a hard time with that one too, so you're off the hook. Oh, I'm looking forward to the presentation that you're going to share with us on the investment opportunity in Generation Forest. But to kick things off, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do at Generation Forest?
Yeah, thank you. I am Andreas Eke and I live in Panama, and that's a little different to many other investment managers. I'm the CEO of Generation Forest Invest, which is a Dutch company, but we have our holdings here in Panama. And I'm the CEO of the company. And this I have been doing for the last 30 years.
Now, I guess let's get right into the presentation, shall we?
So with the Generation Forest, we are aiming at what we consider the future of forestry. And I will explain why I believe that is. You can see the logos of two organizations here. Generation Forest Invest is, as I said, a Dutch company who is open for mostly family offices, high net worth individuals to invest in long-term forest holdings. And the Generation Forest is a German cooperative which democratized the access to forest investment, and normal citizens with lower budgets are able to join us and to create forest and to hold Generation Forest for a long time. And we are happy to announce that we are more than 8,500 members from all over the world who are now owning the forest in Panama. Iliana and myself, we founded Futuro Forestal, was our company called initially 30 years ago. And at that time, what we looked at were teak monoculture plantation. And we intended to create better practices around the teak monoculture plantation. The better practices were social, environmentally, and also operational. And a lot had to do with the question of how we understood the risk management in this long-term investment. And one of the first things we did, we incorporated native tree species, a little bit naive at that time, into teak plantations. Even so this was a little naive at that time, it gave us what we now have 30 years of experience of silviculture of these native species. We still lack a lot of knowledge. What is a Generation Forest concept? The idea is that the forest system, and it's basically the differentiation we have. The forest should be productive, and we are now in the field of carbon economy, and we know that there are a lot of natural restoration projects which are not productive beside the capacity of capturing carbon. We believe that the forest to be protected and to be a stable system for decades or maybe even centuries, it should and needs to be productive. And I also believe that the experience out of the last, let's say, 50 years intends to protect the forest, that the forests which were productive were easier to protect than those who actually lacked a business plan, who lacked a business case. So we believe that the forest of the future should be productive, and there is a distinction to natural regeneration projects who do not have timber production or other potentially non-timber forest production. The second element is also distinctive, is biodiverse. So we believe that the forest needs to be biodiverse, and we need to overcome the separation of protection on one side in one geography and production in the other geography. We believe that the big task for all economics, for all companies, for all sectors, is to transition to a sustainable business. Only if the forest itself produces and is biodiverse at the same time, it can provide the services we need from the forest long term. And of course, there is a distinction to monoculture plantation. I want to make clear, we are not, at this point, we are not against or enemies of monoculture plantations. Monoculture plantations have been a fantastic experience over the last centuries, and we are producing enormous amount of raw materials in relatively limited spaces, and that itself is a big value. But for the future, to really have long-term sustainability, we believe that this has to be mixed with biodiversity. So production and biodiversity. A big element, just to mention one technical issue, is the understory. So one big step for a monoculture plantation could be allowing understory with different spacings. The understory creates an enormous biodiversity impact right away. And then the last element of the concept and the distinction we have on the market is that we are permanent forest, which means that we go through a planting and thinning process as a normal plantation would go, but at the same time, then we do not have a final harvest. We go over to a permanent system after, and this of course depends on the site, etc. But let's say we plant an initial density of 800 trees, we are going down to something around 200, 250. And from then on, we do not thin or do not do final harvest, but selective extraction. We started with the permanence under the biodiversity focus. So we thought that if I have a final harvest, biodiversity above soil is completely gone with the final harvest. But if and that was our motivation to create a permanent forest system so that the capacity of holding biodiversity of the forest is maintained. Now, with the carbon business, actually it becomes a competitive advantage for us that we are permanent. So these are the three things. You can name a generation forest or permanent, productive, biodiverse forest. So here you can see how this looks. This is kind of a timeline from left to right. We start with deforested cattleland. We make sure that the degradation is not too advanced, and often we not buy land because the degradation has been too much already, and because we still need a high carrying capacity because we want to produce timber and capture carbon. Then we plant a mix of native fine timber species on the area, between 3 and 6 per site. We have a portfolio of a little bit over 20, but per site we believe that the biodiversity is not so much affected by this, that we have a limited number of species we plant. And we do this at about 93 to 95% of the surface, and then an additional 5% of the surface is planted with a wide array of different species. So I have a high biodiversity, but I also concentrate only on a handful of species for later commercialization of the timber. Then we go on, we thin, but natural regeneration or planting is closing the thinning gaps Then in the year until the year 35, so we are cash negative until the year 20, until the year 35. We do then strong thinnings, recover all the invested amounts and making good profit. And then from the year 30 to 35 on, we go into the permanent phase, which is selective harvesting, regrowth, and never clear cutting. So all the biological functions of this, what we consider natural infrastructure for humankind to live on this planet for a very long time. And financially, this is very viable because I can sell so much more carbon than plantations which have a final harvest, because I have a permanent carbon stock which increases for many, many decades to come. So we understand that the shortcomings of conventional forest projects is this, in the case of a natural regeneration, that you don't need people, and the forest without people is not safe. So this kind of fortress conservation, and the only people you hire are guards, so the local community is not using the forest somehow, is not a safe model for the carbon. And the monocultures, as already mentioned, they have very, very low biodiversity. There are some mixed models we look at which are pretty interesting, but in general, biodiversity is very low. And biodiversity becomes a monetarily important value. We are able to sell our carbon considerably above market because of the high biodiversity, which is manifested in our FSC Environmental System Service certification and the CCB certification additional from Verda. And then
if I interrupt you for a quick second,
please. Yes.
I'll try to keep most of my questions to the end, but just as they come up, I might interrupt briefly. Are you able to share a little bit of the price premium that you're able to achieve?
Yes. So about 3.5, 4 years ago, we sold at 27 when the market was at 14. And now the differentiation is not as big no more. We are around $40 now, but the market has increased. The price has increased, which is really interesting because it means there is a bigger recognition of the premium portion of the market. So the prices have gone closer as the market recognizes, the buyers recognize this, that it is good to pay more for the carbon, especially because it is, we understand that the corporates don't want buy a PR liability. They want to buy a solution to the carbon compensation and a communication tool. And if that somehow has problems, then you spend money on doing good and then get bad press. That's really what the companies want to avoid, and that's why they pay more. But right now we are looking at VM47, and we believe that the initial negotiations we're having now are above $60. Restoration with production, that's basically what we are doing. And we consider that our forest restoration is a game changer the way we do it. I repeat this fast. So we have a resilient forest system, mostly native species. We are not dogmatic where depending on the clients, if the clients are fine with exotic, we incorporate, for example, teak, up to 20% teak in certain sites. When I have an excellent teak for the first generation, that's very good for the cash flow. And the environmental impact is, as mentioned, very high. So I have a very high carbon sequestration between 800 and 1,000 ton during the first 35 years. For VM47, it's around 800. And we can sell so much carbon because we are permanent forest. And of course, there are the other ecosystem services. We are right now talking to the Panama Canal Authority about payments for water services. So our forests are definitely helping the Panama Canal watershed. And we have clients are interested, especially in the Panama Canal watershed, because they are clients of the Panama Canal and they want to have this contribution. And then at the end, we have selective extraction, we regrow, and we never clear cut. So we have a permanent forest system. And just to make the numbers very easy, if I have an increase of 8 to 10 cubic meters of round timber per hectare in the permanent phase, if I'm selling 6 of those of 35, 40-year-old fine tropical timber, I can net about $200 per cubic meter. That means I'm above $1,000 net profit per hectare, basically forever. And if I compare that to what the cattle farmer is now making, they're making less than $100, which means that the generation forest is the highest and best long-term use for this land, which we believe is the main protection for the forest. Being you would not burn down your rental house, right? So it doesn't make sense to burn the forest down, because being the highest and best use. And of course, there are a lot of socioeconomic impacts. There is industry being created around now, sawmills showing up. So it's a real forest cluster generating, because of productive forest, sustainable jobs. Of course, we train people in remote rural areas, and many of our collaborators are indigenous, who are not only the guys with the machete, but also the drone pilots, and we are proud of them. So the triple impact, the impact investors are looking at, we believe impact investing should be mainstream, and with the IRR we are generating, it definitely now is market. And it's very interesting. Before, we had lower IRRs than the mainstream monoculture plantations. But now the impacts, climate, community, and biodiversity, making us more competitive and actually generating above market. So it's really interesting how the carbon and environmental system economy has changed the way we look at forest. Just some images. Here you can see our Embera collaborators with their children, they say. They call the plants, the seedlings, their children. And this picture is also an original picture in an area 5 years ago we only had cattle, and now jaguars are coming back. So we're really proud. And we believe, again, biodiversity certificates will be out there, but still the market is not there. There are some really brave people like our colleagues from Qualbro, etc., who are doing it already, and we admire them for this. Our strategy at this point is, through showing the biodiversity and having the data, to show the biodiversity and increase the carbon price for now, until there is a more solid biodiversity market. But we're definitely looking at other markets like water biodiversity and even soil restoration, because while we produce timber, we restore soil. So the ways to invest with us is, as mentioned, Generation Forest Invest. And it's a Dutch private company, and we are now in an investment round for another $25 million to buy land and to initiate more reforestation, to be then able to sell the carbon, and we sell the carbon in advance. And it's basically the idea that the carbon is paying for the biological asset, and equity pays for the land. And at the end, we will stay with a beautiful, high-value forest asset forever. This is for families, mostly intergenerational wealth preservation. As you know, forest has this beautiful economical function others investments don't have, that you can preserve wealth over many generations to come. And that's most of our investors are looking like this at the investment. So illiquid, very long term, but high value increase. And a smaller portion is looking at an exit scenario we are creating in 5 to 6 years. This is also possible depending on what the idea is. And the cooperative I already mentioned, more than 8,000 citizens of the world coming together. Right now a share is 1,600 euros. And I don't know if there is another retail investment. And we use the cooperative because it's the most transparent way to invest into forest. And in Germany especially has a very long history that people own forest together in a cooperative. But this cooperative is legally located in Hamburg, but our members are global and our reforestation is in Panama. And we democratize the access to the generation forest through that cooperative. That's what the cooperative has generated in capital. It's a bit more above the 40 million now, 8,500 members and 2,500 hectares of land acquired in 1.5. This is more or less so 20 shares equal 1 hectare. So that's easy to understand and to calculate. It has not been easy the last years because of many environmental political backslash and the Ukraine war, and the attention of the people has gone into a different direction. But now we feel that people are coming back and understanding that the underlying problems of climate change and biodiversity loss are not gone. And many of our investors buy this, for example, for their children or grandchildren.
Can I just ask you a quick question before we move ahead? Under this model, are these investors also buying the land, or are they kind of more going into the model where they're supporting the reforestation activities and thus owning the biological assets and not the land?
We are a strong believer of owning the land. So the legal structure is a German cooperative, which is 100% owner of a Panamanian SPV, which owns the land and the forest. So we own the land. We believe that renting the land in a permanent forest system would be somehow hypocritical. You say you are creating a permanent system and then you rent the land, and what do you do after your rental agreement stops, right? So, and sustainability, we believe owning the land is creates more sustainability. And we also strongly believe this is not land grabbing, because the local landowners, they need to sell the land because extensive cattle farming is not viable no more, and they are happy that there is someone who can buy the land and do something with it. As you can see, the IRR is very low because it's small scale and relatively not such an efficient structure than an investment, and also to be conservative, right? There were lots of retail forestry investment offerings with very high IRR, so we are really keeping this on the low side here.
Is it low compared to we haven't talked about the other model yet, but is it low because of the economies of scale that are lost by a smaller capital size?
Yeah, it is. It is relatively expensive to find the new members.
Okay.
So, and it's also to stay on the conservative side. And what we have been done until now, we have not actually sold the carbon, which we generate the certificate until now. For now on, the members will decide whether they want or not to sell the carbon. That would, of course, also increase the IRR.
So is this IRR based on timber alone?
Yes. That's basically, look at this. So project IRR is something like 6.5 for this. And the gap is the cost of the small scale and of the relatively high administrative and marketing costs, etc. All that you need to do and attend the members. Right? If you have 8,500 potential people to ask you a question, that is a cost.
Yeah, I'll say. Sorry,
but
continue.
But the people are fine with it. Many of our members, and I'm a member of the cooperative as well, and my children are, they are actually fine with that also being long-term. And those who have exited have already realized this 4.5%. So there is some track record that the 4.5% is real. Those who exited, very few exited, sorry, but those who have realized the 4.5%. So I think it's important to be on the conservative side. Many people feel that this is a way to reduce their environmental impact and footprint. And it's a little bit like a donation, but it's not gone, or like a service payment, but it has some future profit. With this, I closed the Generation Forest Cooperative. Companies have now, more than 200 companies have become members now. And
this model.
Under this model, and have combined that somehow with their product. A sauna company who is reforesting with us the surface of all the saunas they are selling. And then the people who buy the sauna get a little leaflet saying, we reforested the area in Panama of your, and there the timber is growing of what we used here. All these kinds of beautiful little initiatives.
What?
Generation Forest Invest already, so preferred shares in the Dutch BV, 25 million to buy land. And the investment is in the Dutch holding, fully integrated structure. So we own the management company in Panama, we own the nursery company, and we own SPVs where the forestry projects are in. Among one, for example, is one we pre-finance with carbon from Julius Baer in Switzerland. But the forest will be ours long term. So Julius Baer will get the carbon and we get the forest. You invest in 30-year-old management company, Futuro Forestal, with most of the experience of native species in Latin America, I would say. And we are aiming at a 50,000 hectare project with over $1 billion asset value. And interestingly, as we pre-sell the carbon, we will be able to create this asset without more equity than the 25 we are asking for now. Because the pre-sale of the carbon will finance the forest.
Okay, but the purchase of more land, will you have that capital from the pre-sale of the carbon to get into the land purchase? Or is it kind of like a borrowing in a way?
So we have different products. One product, and it depends, of course, on the carbon prices. But the carbon prices have been rising to a level where we can also, not only like in the former projects, pay for the biological asset, but we also can pay for the land with the pre-sale of the carbon. Because of the high value of our certificates. But of course, what we will need is some intermediate kind of credit financing, right? And there is some capital cost, of course, we will have to assume. But the interesting thing for our investors is we will not dilute a lot more and then own over $1 billion in fine tropical timber forever in Panama.
Just to hold on that thought for a moment. That intermediate capital need, would that be through a debt structure? Would you be loaning that money from another organization outside of this offer?
Yes, there are two circumstances. One is actually the most sophisticated use is what we call the corporate carbon concession. The market is not there. The market does offset agreements, and then I get a credit to build the forest. And as you said, there we are looking for leverage capital, fund the reforestation and the forest operations through the pre-sale of the carbon certificate, using a credit. As we own the land, and this is a big difference to the natural regeneration projects. Natural regeneration projects only have the carbon value. If something goes wrong in our case, we can use the land and the forest as a collateral. Carbon market disappears, we can still pay back the credit. And that means that our capital cost is lower than in the case of only looking at carbon as the only value. Because if then the carbon market disappears, you are on rented land, then all your money is gone. That's not the case in our. But we have something which is called the corporate carbon concession, which is for the more sophisticated corporates which have a lower capital cost. Because if you are a bank and you have a capital cost of 6% or less, why should you buy carbon where a credit cost of 8 to 12% is incorporated? So you get your carbon cheaper, using your own capital, buying the corporate carbon concession. But this is a little complicated, but I'm happy to.
No, I think it makes sense, but I think what I'm hearing is that you're providing also an avenue for those who are not necessarily going to own the land themselves, but they're leasing it from you in a way, not you, Generation Forest, to get their carbon in that regard. Is that, I understand that?
Well, the corporate carbon concession, if you look at the cash flow, and let's do that. So it's basically the carbon sale. You can see they are compensating. I mean, this is carbon in relation to timber is a very low value. But carbon is eliminating the, I mean, we love the forestry investments, we accept that the very late cash flow is a disadvantage of timber investments, and carbon is getting rid of it. So carbon is basically giving me a positive cash flow very early, and initially it compensates my negative cash flow from building the forest. And then, but that itself is beautiful because I have very little capital need if I'm able to sell it. And this is what we call the corporate carbon concession, the pre-sale of the carbon, right?
Okay.
The corporate pays for the negative cash flow of the forest and gets 90% of the carbon. And we stay with 10% of the carbon and the forest and land asset after the collateral is liberated.
Good. Thank you. That's helpful.
So that's why we are targeting a return of 12.5% over the next 25 years. I would have thrown people out of my office if they would offer me a 12% return on fine tropical timber. But the difference is the carbon. So the timber is the 7 to 8%, and the difference is the ability to sell the carbon, and that gets us into this. So 2 ways to invest: one, shared mission, creating these generation forests, as many as possible, as fast as possible, to maximize financial returns and positive impact. And this is a specific thing. Before closing, I would like to show this. What you can see here is the Darien area. The orange areas are our already existing forests. So you can see we do show up in the landscape, not big enough yet, but already. And in this potential green Panama Canal area, which is blackly surrounded, we want to create a corridor connecting the coastal forest of the Atlantic to the coastal and mangroves of the Pacific. And the benchmark for this is that actually the big felines are using it. And so we are looking for the capital either through the capital raise or through the carbon sale to build this. And you can see this up in the north. Within this is the Julius Baer forest. So Julius Baer has already a stake there. And I think this is important for the market. The market is going away from plainly just saying this is carbon compensation to this is contribution to rural development, to development of indigenous community, to creating corridors for jaguars, to all these other impacts. And the market appreciates these impacts. So
Can you just go back there for a second?
happy to do that, yes.
Okay. I would assume that the dark green, the forest cover that's kind of large and contiguous is natural forest. Am I correct?
Yes.
More on the Pacific side.
On the Atlantic side.
Or on the Atlantic side, sorry, on the Atlantic side. And then there's a lot of non-forest, deforested area, and then there's speckles of green. Is a lot of that teak development?
Yes, we are in the teak area, but the teak times are kind of over because teak has very specific soil requirements, and we believe that there's very little teakable land left.
Teakable land, I like that.
Yeah. And for example, we have farms, and that's why we're saying if the client is fine with a little bit of exotic in the first generation, we buy a farm, and from that farm, I could perfectly use teak, but only to 10-15%. And if you only work with teak, you cannot buy that farm. You cannot buy 100%.
I see, because it's only productive, like good quality teak land on maybe 10 to 15%.
Exactly. And there are, of course, areas which are 100%, no, 100% not, but let's say 80% teakable, but those have already been acquired. And we have a beautiful teak industry in Panama, exporting over 10,000 containers of teak a year already, which has been a big learning. But also we know the limitations of this. Let's see what the next cycle would bring, right? In terms of mineral extraction and long-term sustainability. Okay, so please join us and ask questions.
Well, I have some questions for you, and we'll make sure to put the contact information and access to the slide deck in the show notes as well. So, a couple of questions. I noted that the more institutional offer has 12.5% compared to the 4.5%. But I remember you saying even the 4.5% costs bring you up to 6.5%. So what's the difference between this 12.5% and even going on the high end for the more individual model of 6.5%? What's the difference here in return expectations?
Happy to share that. Actually, we are happy to share all kinds of information because we want to motivate people to build this kind of forest, even if they're not calling it generation forest. So we have very open policy. If people are interested, we are happy to introduce them to the themes and to share knowledge, even if they're not becoming a client of ours. So we are happy to share that. If I say one number, and these things are ranges, right? So a native species reforestation project in Panama can get you something around 7.5% if I just tell you one number. But we know it's a range around that. Could go up to 8.5% and could be lower depending on specific site, land acquisition cost, etc. So 7.5%, but then the cooperative only manages something like 1,500 hectares at this point. So I have a negative scale effect. For that, we took another percent off from the 7.5%. We had 6.5% project IRR. And then going down to 4.5%, the 2% are due to the marketing efforts, to the administration, to the compliance, managing a cooperative in Germany. All these costs are in there. And yes, it's conservatively calculated and it might come out better, but we prefer to make this conservative. So you can start at the 7.5%. And if I do this the other way around, from the 7.5% to the 12 or 12.5%, maybe even more under circumstances, this is purely defined through the carbon price. And of course, for the IRR, it's important. The carbon money is not only the amount of money, but it's early money, which gets you higher IRR. So that's how the structure is. If you want to go down, you go down from 12.5% to 8.5%, 7.5%. Carbon, and then you have the timber returns, and then you can go down because of scale in case of the cooperative, and then you go further down because of the overhead cost. And I mean, our internal calculation are about a percentage above that what we publish.
Okay. But that makes sense. That the big difference is the smaller model, like the individual model, doesn't include carbon, and that's the big difference between the two. Is that carbon is built in to the more institutional model.
Exactly.
You mentioned that you work with some exotics. Which species that we would know? We've talked about teak, but what are some of the maybe more household names in terms of tropical species that you work with that are kind of well known by the market?
In Panama, only teak. And actually, teak has big advantages. 20 years ago, teak was far the best growing species, but that's over. Native species are very competitive. Now, as we're kind of, if you want, so we have gone back to Brazil in the beginning of the 20th century, where eucalyptus came from Australia and got something like 18 cubic meters or something like this, right? And then the selection started. And we start with this right now with the native species. So we have actually found more species. There are 3,000 tree species in Panama. Imagine what a richness in genetic information. So, and then we have started with selection within the species, getting better growth. So teak is not necessarily the fastest and most fastest growing in mass, right? So not volume, but mass, the fastest growing. But teak has other advantages because it has a stable market, which is something important, of course. And for some investors, they just want this as the more known species to have 10 or 20% in this. Let me share something else for 1 second. It takes a little time to do this.
While you're finding it, what are some more local species to Panama that we might know?
Well, rosewood and let me see. So to get you an idea about the scenery we are working in, this is a typical landscape. In the back, you see a national park. We are close to national parks. We like this to be close to existing forests. And this is 5 years later. So, and here you can see a ceiba, and this ceiba has 16 months, is 16 months old. I have to say, ceiba is not a fine tropical timber. This is more for veneer, but you can see an enormous growth, right? So the idea that native species are not growing, when we started, people were saying that the general assumption was native species are not worth it. We could show that, and of course the biodiversity element then becomes an important additional added value you do not have. But we managed teak with understory and have quite some biodiversity because of the understory. We allow an understory between the teak. So, and the native species, very important is rosewood. And rosewood, we also had a selection process which allowed us to have very good form in relation to most of the rosewoods. And the management is very difficult, but very interesting. And rosewood, price-wise, is incredible, had an incredible increase of prices. They were around $400 like 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago. Similar to, let's say, mature teak. And they're now about $4,500. They tenfold.
Where are the main markets for your
Actually,
wood?
if you get into Japan, you might get up to $10,000 a cubic meter. So China and Japan, but it's also a difficult market because if you take rosewood out of the forest, that's illegal because they are on the CITES list, right? So it's an endangered species, which gets us some. So now we get new problems we didn't have before because of the high value. We need to have surveillance. People steal that. If you steal one tree, you are done for a year. So we need to be careful. These are new tasks, but I think every forester loved the idea that you need to safeguard your trees because they're so valuable. That's what we always wanted. That the timber and the forest is so valuable that finally the money flows in and we can build.
How do you manage the CITES listed issue of rosewood?
We have a forest registry.
Okay, so as long as you track it,
if you plant it and
fine.
track it, and we have the government looks at the verifies if you're really having them, and then annual revision of this. Quite some bureaucratic effort, but you can do it, and by that you are allowed to sell it. And we do not calculate with this increase for all native species, which will not happen. But we have other very valuable species. Of course, mahogany is one. Cedar and like mountain almond is a beautiful, very strong timber as well, with high biodiversity impact, because the almonds are appreciated by many animals in the forest. If you go in a forest, this looks like a forest. So,
Yeah. Okay. Now, what about, I mean, it all sounds too good to be true, but it also sounds complicated. Like this isn't for the weak of heart to manage a production forest like this. Can you tell us a little bit about the costs? Because I envision it is, at the beginning that you showed us this picture that it's a degraded landscape. So your establishment, I would expect, is going to be similar to a monoculture plantation establishment. Then you have this regime where you sometimes replant or fill in the gaps, and sometimes you let nature do it. When you go in for your harvesting events, you're not taking everything out. So you have to be more careful, which of course costs money and lowers your efficiency. So when you build all of this in, and the fact that you don't have a final harvest, how do your operational costs compare to, let's say, your neighbor monoculture teak plantations, and even aged as well?
we definitely have higher complexities, and through that slightly higher cost. But the biggest issue here is knowledge. So we have made mistakes in the past out of not knowing the right thing, not knowing it well enough. So there was one species, Zapatero, Hieronima alchonoides. We planted on sites we believed that it's good because it naturally showed up, but it was like limited. And then there was an attack by bacteria, which killed 80%. So pest-like event. So why that happened was knowledge. So in the past, our costs were higher because of that. Not so much in the terms, for example, there are some, if you go through the whole chain of value, in the nursery, teak needs 2.5, 3 months. Some of these native species need 8 months. And nursery cost is how long is the plant in the nursery defines your cost. So I have double the cost, nursery cost, because it stays double the time in it. That, for example, is a disadvantage where we have higher cost. But still the biggest risk is the lack of detailed long-term knowledge. And we are very frank about that. But also now we are much more confident because we have made a lot of mistakes over the 30 years. We will not repeat. And now in the species portfolio we are quite certain, but we still need more. And that's why we collaborate with the ETH in Zurich. We collaborate with Freiburg University, with local university, with Yale on research, on science, which is a very big thing, which cost us money. Others already have that in teak manuals. We have to create it. So it's not that easy, that it's just more expensive. It also has a lot of advantages. So I tell you one. If I have an insect attack reducing the foliar area of the plantation. If it happened on a monoculture, I need to use chemicals to get rid of it, right? In our case, we look at it, we put a point with the GPS, we come back later 2 days, look at it, and in most of the cases, the attack has ceased. Why? Because we have more than 50 bird species in our forest. A native plantation doesn't have that. So I have certain things which are costs, higher costs, and others which are lowering risk and cost. But if we get more knowledge, I'm pretty sure that mixed native species forest will be the future. Also because of lower cost.
Right. Yeah, you're lowering the costs down the road and these unknown costs associated with the risks, especially when you throw climate change into it and how species will be moving in terms of their preferred landscapes. It's having that built-in resilience
Yeah.
is really important. I want to talk about your land acquisition. I don't know, maybe you could pull up the map of the Green Panama Canal. That you have this ambition for 50,000 hectares.
A bit more than a tenth of that.
A tenth of that. Okay. Yeah. So I'm wondering how your process looks like in terms of, I mean, we don't need to get into all the technical details of how you assess a parcel, but just kind of get a rough idea of how much have you already assessed for feasibility, maybe within the Green Panama Canal, and what does your timeline look like? So from, let's say you identify a parcel, you run it through your feasibility assessment, you negotiate with landowners, you deal with all the legal implications of the land transaction. How long would you say conservatively until you can get trees on the ground in that new site?
Right. Maybe a short jump into history. We have acquired more than 24,000 hectares when we worked for other investors as managers. So we have a lot of experience, more than 200 transactions. And of course, this is quite complex. We have a rate of 1 to 10. So we look at 10 hectares or 10 farms and one qualifies because we have very high expectations and requirements. And as you know, most of the money has been lost in forestry because people have planted species on the wrong site. So in Panama, many people went into the teak hype and planted teak on sites which were not good for teak, and they lost money there. So this is actually for us, it's a very important moment of the whole value chain, if you want, so of reforestation. And we have a team of 6 people, and it mixes all kinds of local knowledge. It's very interesting, the process, how we bring several people because they have different views within the team. Some is more on the soil side, the other person sees more social elements. Existing vegetation has to be evaluated. So it's quite a complex, and of course we calculate the scenery you have seen, for example, was in Colón. This is an area you cannot see on this map. It's in another part of Panama. Very steep hills, and of course that we have to figure in the higher cost. We cannot mechanize the work. And so we are looking at mechanizability, access, how good is the access. We have bought things on the other side of the river where we only get with boats, etc., or on an island, etc., to get lower land prices. All these has to be taken into account. So it's quite a complex process. But the evaluation of a farm is relatively fast. It could take from the first contact to the yes or no about 2 months. And then also legal is important. We need to make sure not to buy a problem, but a clean title, and also make sure that this property has not been part potentially of a money laundering scheme or something. So we only buy from long holding people who hold this for a long time, the land. So we do a big due diligence on all that. And then the acquisition takes another 3 months, and then it's just how much time is it until the next planting season, which normally starts in June or July. If you want to, you could do that in a year.
1 year, more or less. Okay. And how many hectares do you have in your pipeline at the moment that you've assessed to some level of
qualified 4,800 now. This is quite a cost,
of
right?
course.
So you don't want to make the pipeline too big.
Well, and also because you're negotiating already with landowners and you don't want them to get excited and get their hopes up. And if you don't have the investment ready, then maybe they'll find someone else that does.
That's exactly, it is very important how the local people see you. And there are you don't want to be the gringo. He is talking a lot and blah blah, and then nothing happens. This. You buy a farm and everybody knows it. 200 kilometers around. I don't know how this works, but Darien is big, but it's
Yeah,
small. And also we are looking at other parts of Panama. Of course, we have been looking at other parts of.
good. Well, we're running down on time, but I want to touch on the risks, but also leave on positivity. So, what would you say are your biggest risks and how you're mitigating them?
Actually, I have always believed that there is not one outstanding risk, and that forestry management is actually looking at all these small things in a row,
Mm-hmm.
one together. So, I mean, there are certain risks, as I already mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
If you buy the wrong land, that is a big risk. So, again, I would first of all say general scientific and silvicultural knowledge is a big risk. And that's also, we have planted more than 85 tree species, only 20 are in the portfolio we are using, right? So, and maybe others will come, but we need more time and more knowledge and having research plots and understand how they grow. So we need to train people in all kinds of things. Now seeing this young indigenous people having a pilot license for drones, professional flying license for pilot license for drone. So those are the beautiful things. But again, the risk is daily. There are risks. Controlling has to be very good. And so for us, I don't see one single risk. I see many, many elements. And we have optimized a lot over the last 30 years. So now we are working with a Danish company creating a digital mirror of the forest where we will not only use remote sensing, and that's why we want to work with these people. There are a lot of people coming up with remote sensing, but they go in and put points from which they make photos in the forest itself. It's all put into an AI program, and we can see that the results are fantastic because the AI at the end correlates stuff we don't. And as more data we put into the system, as better and more accurate we get with our precision forestry approach by creating that digital mirror of the physical and biological reality. So, and that more knowledge then will reduce the risk, right, and may have more efficiency. Also for harvesting, I think we're gonna drone log in the future. I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah, absolutely. More information is key, and we're really lucky to be in that age where the technology is just advancing so fast. So excellent, excellent. Well, I would like to also end on a positive note. So a couple of things. Congratulations. I know you recently celebrated your 30th anniversary. So I'm sure that was a nice party and a nice event. Do you have anything that you'd like to say about that?
It was a beautiful site. It was at the Biodiversity Museum, which is a Frank Gehry building in Panama. Everybody who comes should see that Biodiversity Museum. And it was beautiful because it was not so much about us. We had our ecosystem coming and talking about what they do. And I think this is very symbolic for the times we are in. These are not times to close. These are times to open, to collaborate. And one of our strengths has always been that we have been like sharing information, knowledge, ideas, and be very open. And of course, that's not always good. But at the end, the tendency that this is better than the contrary. And the 30th anniversary was a beautiful sign of our ecosystem. And out of that, now people starting generation forests in Mexico, Costa Rica, and Chile. So we are looking for a good expansion of the concept.
Excellent, excellent. Any other parting words that you'd like to leave us with, Andreas?
Well, I would like to thank you because you're doing just what I just said. We share knowledge, we share experience, and we should do more of that. And we will do more of that. And organizing like a working seminar on native species, we are aiming at that, doing that. Inviting people all over the world who work with native species because we believe that the future is in biodiverse, very productive and profitable and permanent forests.
Excellent. Well, Andreas, thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
And for introducing the Generation Forests to us. We'll put all the links to you and Generation Forests in the show notes for the audience to learn more. So have a great day and thank you again. That's it for today. I'm Shauna Makovich from the Forest Link, helping asset managers and project developers raise and deploy capital to impactful forest investment faster. I hope you join me again next time for Pitch Pod.